Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, and it is now a course at NYU and an elective towards the journalism certificate. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes, and follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. And I am so happy to have Jeannine Ouellette with us today. And let me tell you a little bit about Jeannine. She is the author of the memoir, The Part That Burns, Split Lip Press, 2021, the children's book, Mama Moon, and several educational titles. Her stories and essays appear widely, and her work has been supported with fellowships from Millay Colony for the Arts and Brush Creek Foundation. She is the recipient of a Margarita Donnelly Prize, Kurt Johnson Fiction Award, Proximity Essay Award, Masters Review Emerging Writers Award, 2 Pushcart nominations, and awards from the Society of Professional Journalists and Medill School of Journalism. Her work has been praised by Joyce Carol Oates as simply beautiful, precisely imagined, poetically structured, compelling, and vivid. Jeannine teaches creative writing with the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop and is the founder and director of Writing in the Dark, an independent creative writing program based in Minneapolis with in-person offerings across the U.S. and internationally, and virtual offerings on Zoom. And Jeannine's Writing in the Dark newsletter on Substack brings her teaching digitally to a community of thousands. Jeannine earned her MFA in fiction from Vermont College of Fine Arts and is working on a novel. So welcome, Jeannine.
Thank you, Estelle. That it's always a little funny feeling, listening to someone read about you like that. But yeah, thank you for that really warm welcome. It's really fun to be here.
It's so great to have you here because I'm somebody who is hyper vigilant about the writing community, and I watch as different people emerge or share their advice or their energies. And I was particularly taken by your spirit of generosity with the people that you work with. And that was a big part of me wanting to have you on the program, plus how you started out maybe a little later in the literary world, which I can completely relate to. I was fully consumer until recently. So I want to talk to you about, we'll start with your book, and then we'll go into all the wonderful things that you've been doing with your Writing in the Dark Substack. You're someone who focuses on beautiful, honest, and evocative writing. And through your book, The Part That Burns, it's so raw and real and revealing. And you can see I have this way when I read of just highlighting parts that really speak to me throughout a book. So first of all, I love talking about process with writers. Can you talk to me about how you got to the point where you were ready to excavate your emotions and write them into the world in the form of this book?
Yeah. And I also just want to say that seeing you hold up my book like that, and for those who are listening, maybe not seeing, it's all full of Post-it notes sticking out all over the top, bottom, and sides. And that's such a feeling of being seen. When I teach writing, I teach close reading, and that feels like a visual manifestation of someone's close reading. And that's really a gift for a writer to have someone pay that kind of attention to the work. And so I don't take that for granted. That feels amazing. So I just wanted to thank you for that. And then with regard to your question, to answer the actual question, you noted that I came a little later to literary writing. The Part That Burns was published, I just turned 56. And so I must have been like 53, right, in 2021. So that's pretty late, for a debut memoir. I mean, not like, I don't know what the average is, but it's not going to get you on any 30 under 30 lists. And I didn't really start publishing. I'm just going to use this term literary as a catch-all. Boundaries are made to be kind of blurred in art, I think. But let's just use that term as a catch-all. I didn't really start publishing my literary work until about 2015. So about, 6 years before the memoir came out. And prior to that, I was writing. I've been writing and publishing since my early 20s, but mostly, like you mentioned in the bio, a lot of journalism. I mean, I wrote everything, Estelle. I wrote everything, some things that we would never want anyone to find on the internet because they're really dumb, Yeah, you do a lot of things to pay the bills. I did a lot of like content writing and stuff. But anyway, so lots of writing my eyes out. And then reached an age where I said, I need to be writing the things that I always dreamed of writing. I need to be writing the things, like you said, thank you for those words about writing that's real and evocative. And because the words you chose, it's like, oh, that's exactly right. That's what I want. That's what I wanted to be doing. And so I knew I needed to start trying to engage, like you said, not just read that kind of work, but try to be a participant and write that way and share that way. And so for me, I didn't intend for that to be a memoir. I didn't want to write that. The Part That Burns deals with some really difficult childhood experiences and then the aftermath of those experiences in my young adulthood. And that wasn't really what I set out to do. I was writing a novel. I wanted to write fiction. I went into my MFA program working on a novel. That's where I thought I was headed, and I still am. And I do write fiction and have published fiction, and I'm working on a novel right now. But what happened in the MFA program is that I was working on the main project, like what will become your creative thesis. And then on the side, I was like, I should be doing some short work and publishing while I'm in this program so that I have make a kind of come out of it with a footprint of published work. So when I start to try to query my book or get the attention of agents, I'll have a literary track record. And so I started working on these shorter pieces and they came out as memoir. I was working on things that were things I had never been able to write before, but I was bringing them through lenses that were really different from the kind of just nonfiction lenses that I had tried to write them before. And I'm really interested in the intersection of fiction and memoir, and not just as a disclaimer or a clarification, this isn't about what's true and not. I'm very sensitive to that, or like about making things up or stretching the truth. No, don't do that. We don't want to do that. But rather about using the art of fiction. And that is to say what you just said, language that is evocative, imagistic, language that creates sensation, language that makes you feel something, using, the art and craft of fiction, which I hadn't really fully understood when I was younger, and trying to write this material. And that's why it wasn't as transformed, I feel like, as it needed to be, to take something really difficult and make it hopefully meet those standards that you read when you read those words from Joyce Carol Oates, who's I know become a polarizing figure. But that meant so I couldn't believe it, when she said that about my work. It felt like, oh, that's it. That's what I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be, despite being difficult and about some things that are hard to read about, I wanted a reader to feel that way.
Yeah, I mean, you use a lot of metaphor throughout your book, and you particularly use the form of doorways, which is interesting because as we're talking, it's like you were, on the journalism side, and then you found a doorway into the literary world, but you also talk about doorways as these openings, and even in some like heart-wrenching parts where, when you were being abused by your mother's ex-husband or the stepfather mafia, you even say, like, I imagined a doorway. I believe that's what you said for that. And it was even childbirth becomes a doorway to a new understanding for you. And also you use birds as metaphors, right? You use the meadowlark to explain the point when you're with a group of girls and you want to blend in, and you give the contrast. You say the meadowlark, or the similarity, the meadowlark needs to blend into its surroundings. And you need it, like there was something that you did because you were being self-protective, that you didn't protect somebody else, but you then give the example of the meadowlark. It kind of takes the onus off you when you're mentioning the meadowlark in a weird way. I was like, oh, okay, well, it's a nature thing, so I understand. And so you use these metaphors throughout. Was that a conscious choice? Because I'm always fascinated by a writer's process. Or was it something that just evolved and you thought, oh, this is something that I'm using?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And thank you for zeroing in on that. I want to right now mention a craft essay, which I can't remember the title of it, but anyone who wants to look for it would be able to find it. It's on the Brevity blog by Lily Danzinger. It's a craft essay about braiding, the technique of braiding in our work. And one of the things that Lily said in that essay, actually, I think she said it in that essay or writing about that essay, but I think it's in the essay, that when she first started writing braided work, which happened when she was trying to write about the death of her cousin, she didn't even know what a braided essay was. She didn't know what she was doing. She was doing it on instinct. And that really resonated with me, because I feel like when I was initially, the section that you talk about with the meadowlark, like I had made up a bunch of rules for myself. I'm a big believer in writing constraints. And so that section, which is called Tumbleweeds, was written with me giving myself rules. And one of the rules was that I had to include this like biology and mating behavior and so forth of the Western meadowlark. Another rule was that I was going to talk about like the mythology of the jackalope. And another rule was, I don't remember what all the rules were. I think that's the section where I talk about where I have to use the inaugural address of Jimmy Carter. And so what I was doing is looking at those other things, and I didn't know how they would intersect with the personal story. I had no idea. When you discover, there's another chapter in the book where I talk about the geography of the Mississippi headwaters. It's not in the same section you're talking about with the meadowlark. It's the same deal that I was making myself do. And what's really amazing, Estelle, is that, like Lily talks about in her essay about the braided essay, when you look, some things are too bright. She's talking about the sun. She's talking about eclipses. We can't look directly at an eclipse because it will, blind us. Some things are like that. Some topics are like that too. You, as the writer, and maybe sometimes the reader, you can't really stare directly at them. You have to kind of look askance, but you can find, in that place where you're looking askance, you can find something that's extremely true and reflective of the thing itself. And so that's a technique that I used, and you felt it with the meadowlark. That same section that you're talking about deals with my childhood best friend, Holly, whose family I spent a ton of time. I lived at her house in 6th grade. And so when I was learning about the meadowlark as a part of writing that section, I learned that about these cowbirds who will like take over they'll steal the meadowlark's nest, and sometimes they'll raise the other birds' babies as their own, and sometimes they won't. And it just like hit me right in the heart. It just lit me up, just all the complexities, and even feeling for her parents who probably had some idea, but what can you do? And they couldn't just scoop me up and take me into their nest, so to speak. But instead of trying to explain all that, the meadowlark thread I feel like you're right. It relieved me of a lot of the burden of that kind of verbiage, which can weigh the story down. It can be too interior. It can, some of those things don't need to be said out loud. And the world, I'm really thinking about this a lot right now because I'm teaching embodied writing, but the world is full of metaphor. The world is, it offers itself. The world brings the metaphors to us if we are willing to look closely enough, be patient enough. They can come to the surface and present themselves to us, and you can say, like with the metaphor, oh, there it is. There it is.
That's fascinating that you gave yourself rules. Like you just said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Did that come out of your MFA program? Was that something that you learned that you should do?
I didn't learn it in my MFA program, although I'm going to give a shout out to one of my advisors. His name is Brian Leung. I did my MFA at Vermont College of Fine Arts, and I did do a really fun workshop with him one semester that was on, it was basically on speculative writing, like fantasy, but broader than that. And it was really fun. And he did give us an exercise that resulted in a section in my book. Had all these wild rules. Like we had to have, I don't remember them right now, but it was like this, that, the other thing. And then the thing that really appealed to me was a staircase that's both necessary and useless, something like that. And I was like, that's so cool. And so I ended up writing a section of my book that was also published as a short story in North American Review called The Climb, and where this girl is taking these old boards, the girl being me, my, childhood self, to try to build this useless staircase. But again, it's what you said about doorways. She's trying to escape something. It's necessary, but it's useless. And so those constraints can be so helpful. But I didn't learn it in my MFA program. I learned it from a really brilliant teacher who is a poet. He's a poet and a movement teacher in Britain. His name is Paul Matthews, and he teaches writing in the most strange, unconventional way that I have ever encountered. And the way that I encountered his teaching was I used to be an elementary and middle school teacher. I was taught at Waldorf schools. And so I was doing a teacher training. So it didn't even have anything to do with writing. And I almost didn't take his workshop because at that time I was doing a ton of writing for a regional arts and culture magazine called The Rake. I had a lot of deadlines. I was doing a lot of writing I always did moonlighting when I was teaching full time in the elementary and middle school. And anyway, by and large, I just thought that just doesn't sound that fun. I don't think I need more writing right now. But some other colleagues talked me into it. They said, no, I think you'll really love Paul's workshop. You should do it. And it was wild. It was just unlike anything can describe, and nothing like anything I had experienced before, and really fun. And it just broke my writing open in ways that, really nothing before or since has. I'm so grateful. I credit Paul all over my newsletter and he recently reached out to me. Somebody must have told him about writing in the dark and the Substack. And he's older. Like, I don't know how old Paul is, but older than we are. And he found it and he emailed me through like Substack. You can reply to a post, or he found a way to contact me. And he was really quite tickled to find that this little seed he planted, this was back in like 2010, 9 or 10, that this little seed that he, like, you don't know what impact you're going to have on people.
Yeah. It reminds me of this movie, one of my favorite movies that I learned about from childhood. It's A Wonderful Life. And we touch so many lives. We don't realize it. We just don't have any idea. And so he probably was just so astounded when he heard and felt so good. It feels so good. It's like what you said, feeling seen.
Yes. And can you imagine, he teaches so many teachers because, his workshop was a teacher training workshop. So imagine probably hundreds or thousands of teachers have come through, and done these exercises with him. And then to find that there's this, like you said, this, community of thousands, this like really engaged, vibrant community that was inspired, really largely inspired by what he woke up in me, which was this idea that language it has a dimension that we will never fully understand what's possible, what can be done with words. And there is no real repetition. Like we can learn craft and we can learn like braiding. Yeah, okay, that's a neat thing. And we can play with it and we can do things with it. But we can't expect it to deliver, what it did yesterday, tomorrow, because we're a different person. The story may call for a different technique. We have to stay so open, so willing. Really, ultimately, what Paul says is that we have to be willing to produce absolute rubbish. And it's true. If we're not willing to play around and experiment and let it not work, then we aren't going to get the good stuff.
I'm so glad that you're pointing that out, because a lot of people, I teach writing classes, and I say, we're going to do an exercise, and people are so nervous. And I say, you don't have to be perfect. It just has to be out.
Yes.
This is not Mensa. This is not, we're going to have it perfectly submitted and it's going to appear in the Atlantic tomorrow. This is an exercise to get out the feelings, the emotions, the situation in the story. I want to talk a little bit more about the book and then get into the Substack. This is such a great conversation. So it's really interesting to me how you start the book. You start with your mom and her dogs, and the nurturing and the care she is lavishing over these dogs, the care which she did not give you. So there's a real dichotomy there. And I think you set that up on purpose, right? To show all the differences and how she can kind of give herself. Of course, with an animal, it's much less required. It's just the basics. But how did you decide to, as let's see, Maggie Smith, one of my guests, had said, the ramp in or the ramp out. So this was the ramp into the story. How did you decide that?
Yeah, so I'll give you a two-part answer to that. The first part, I'll just say briefly, that wasn't originally the ramp in. When I submitted the manuscript, the first chapter used to be Tumbleweeds, the one we're talking about, where it's a younger narrator. My editor at Split Lip suggested this switch to put the first chapter that you're referring to as Four Dogs, Maybe Five. And she felt, for two reasons. One, well, the reason that she gave is she just felt like she found it very compelling and felt like it would be the most effective structure. I think she might have also said something about, because it starts with an adult narrator. And I'm not 100% sure if she said that, but even if she didn't, I know and had already heard and understood well the risks of a child narrator. Like a child narrator is a polarizing device. Some people really hate them, like really don't like child narrators. So when Christine Langley Mahler's, my editor at Split Lip, made the suggestion, I kind of was like, obviously it's not how I submitted it. It's not how I had understood the structure, but I also thought, yeah, actually, maybe that's the right call. I didn't have any real resistance to it. And I was aware of this issue of the child narrator. So I thought, well, maybe for some people, if they can get that first section in the adult voice, they have that reassurance. And then once the child narrator busts out on the stage, they'll know it's okay. She's not going to be here forever.
So it builds almost a little bit of a different kind of trust, starting with the adult narrator.
And then also there's something that we talk about in memoir, especially when memoir deals with, difficult experiences. There is something about knowing, and that the writer is okay because they survived to write. The book exists in the world. We know, like, in that sense, but there is something comforting about knowing, about hearing this voice from the start that, oh, actually, no, this person in the book. But what you said about the dogs, I wanted to just say something quickly about that. I am aware of the research on our relationships with animals, particularly dogs, horses, and dolphins. There's something that came out recently about this and the role that those animals can play for people who are traumatized for various reasons, including trauma or mental health or other reasons, have a more difficult time interacting with humans and having their needs met with humans. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. And I don't know, in terms of my mom, who as far as I know, has no official diagnoses, but who was not able to provide the kind of care for me that a child would flourish in, for sure. But she was able to have that with Wolfie, with that dog. And I think that for me, observing that Wolfie has since died, he was like 17 and a half or almost 18. He lived a really long, pampered life. But watching that, it was complicated, like so many things are. It was complicated, but I also understood, like you said. And then there was also the reality that my mom's willingness and ability at that time to take over Wolfie's care was a great help to me. I was, had these 3 small children, was going through a really hard divorce, didn't really know how to train a dog, is what I know now, because we have a dog that we have trained. And, like, I didn't grow up with dogs who were trained. I didn't know anything about it. And so here I had this like really, and for listeners who haven't read the book, like Wolfie was a Cairn Terrier. So he was a very feisty. Terriers they have some personality there. And he was chewing up every single thing in the house. And I had the first ever full-time job that I had ever had as a mom. And it was a stressful one, teaching first grade. And so here I am trying to navigate all of this in a very hostile divorce. And then this dog. And it was like the one thing, it was like having that one thing really.
She was able to do something for you. I mean, I just remember some of the dialogue you used. Don't darken my door with this. When you tried to discuss mafia, I just was like, I was so mad at her. But it sounds like you have forgiven as much as it's possible for your own healing. That's what
yeah. Thank you. I mean, I have. My mom doesn't speak to me, like she has not forgiven, but I have, as much as is humanly possible.
That's for you. That's for your healing. That's and as it should be about self-care for you. That's how I feel. It's like, well, for me, for you, I just want you to have the self-care, because it's not about, there's no forgiving for what she did, but you can forgive. You can think that you understand whatever she did to survive. You can equate it to nature and all that, but she was not the right kind of mother that you needed. But you, in turn, and I want to turn this around, have been able to find a doorway through motherhood, because what you write a lot about is the body, and the body contains sensations. I want to read something from your book on page 99. This is about you giving birth to your son. This boy is neither flower nor weed. He doesn't come from the earth. He comes from me. The part that burns is the part that glows. My body is bigger than my body. My body is a nebula, hydrogen and helium, dust and plasma. Bodies are made of cells, are made of atoms, and atoms are billions of years old. My son is slick against my naked chest. His skin is the exact same temperature as mine. His tiny bones are soft and alive. His mouth is a mouth searching for home, and home is the stellar nursery of my skin, my breath, my milk. Hello, baby, I say. His gray eyes float through light years to fix on mine. This, I realize, is a covenant. Sorry, I'm a little emotional. That is beautiful writing. And it really encapsulates your feelings of motherhood. Like, you are going to be the nurturing presence that your mother was not for you, for your baby. And I know you have more, you have another scene of childbirth earlier on, but this one really struck me because it talks about the body, and you talk about the body a lot, and that's part of what you teach. The body is this repository for emotions. And Jeannine, it makes me remember when I first gave birth to my daughter. I was first induced, and then I ended up having a C-section. She was like 8 pounds, 12 ounces, 21 inches long. And afterwards, the hospital gave everyone, which is just so unusual, a complimentary postnatal massage. And all I remember is someone coming to the room saying, "Oh, we're here for your massage." I had just given birth. And all I did was cry the entire time because my body was releasing that trauma of, the 48 hours that I'd gone through with being induced and not being induced, and then my water breaking, and then deciding to have a C-section and having the C-section and all that. And I just thought, yeah, it just really brought home what people in the body care industry had been saying, that your body really is a repository of emotions. So when you think about your body and having been abused as a child, which you talk about in a very concise and not too much information way, but just enough to give the reader the feeling of what you've gone through. I feel like that was a doorway for you to be a different kind of person than your mother, a real separation there. Can you talk about, and the writing is just so beautiful. And, even that your ending of your book, you end with a talk about scar tissue and how you had tripped and when you were young, kind of went back and forth a little bit because we go through the different facets of your life, but how kind of like scar tissue, it builds over it and it's there, it's invisible, but it's there. And that's sort of like the same feeling of what you're going through. So can you talk about that and how you looked at motherhood as a doorway and wrote about it in such an evocative way? It takes in even the feeling, you don't mention it. You mentioned in other places about generational trauma, the feeling that the cells, they change every 7 years, but our bodies are just embodying everything that we've gone through.
Well, yes. And thank you for that was really beautiful reading of that, that birth story from the book. So thank you for that. And I just want to say, first of all, it's really important to me to say that, it definitely was a doorway, motherhood, birth, breastfeeding, the pregnancy, all, from the moment that I became pregnant at 21, this idea of my body's sudden, fierce, and unrelenting insistence on existing and making itself known was shocking. I had, unbeknownst to me, as is often the case for people, like really was very dissociated from my body. And that was perfectly fine. Like I could have been posted like that forever. And pregnancy doesn't do that for all people who have that kind of traumatic dissociation, but it did for me. It was like, whoa, I'm like really awake to this. And it was terrifying. But I really, for whatever complicated set of reasons, I'm not even really sure why I was very drawn to natural birth and breastfeeding and to all of this kind of earth mother embodied kind of approach. And so I gave myself this really steep hill to climb. And I guess maybe there was an instinct there toward healing. Maybe I did understand. I thought I was doing it out of some higher ideal of like natural birth would be safer, or it was always in the service of the baby or the child. But I think with the perspective of time looking back, it's like, to what degree did I understand that I also was really working to heal myself?
It was like a rebirth for you.
Oh, absolutely a rebirth. And I also just wanted, though, to give the disclaimer that doesn't mean in any way, shape, or form that it has been some kind of idyllic path, or that there haven't been painful experiences in our family, or that my kids don't have complaints or have not felt that there have been hurts and imperfections, including, like I've mentioned, a really traumatic and hostile divorce that they had to endure and everything that came as a result of that. And it was destructive and it was painful. So I just wanted, for everyone listening, like, there is no perfect path and there is no pain-free path. That doesn't exist. And that was the hardest lesson ever for me, really hard lesson. But really at the end, I think this circuitous answer is getting me to the point of like a doorway to self, like when we're able to, and that is the ultimate doorway to each other, right? Like if we can actually, pass through that doorway to where we're actually really in ourself and aware of our own, awareness, like, oh yeah, this is me. I exist. This is all of me. All of me exists. I am here. We can, in turn, then really be more available and more generous to each other.
That's beautiful. I am going to segue now to talking about your Substack because, again, your Substack is focusing on beautiful writing. And what you're doing with your Substack, I mean, now there's everybody every day is starting a Substack basically, but your Substack has been profitable. You got an earlier start probably than most, maybe not that much early. Was it last year that you started yours?
Last year, yeah, like at the very end of 2022. So we just passed our 1 year mark in December.
Okay. So
Mhm.
talk to me about what you feel differentiates your Substack from the numerous other ones about writing or getting published out there. I know you have a regular practice, prompts, have a community that you've built, but I'm going to let you say it in your words.
Well, Estelle, I mean, I do have thoughts, but they might sound kind of weird. So let me just to see how I want to approach this, because I will say that it has been wild. Like it wasn't what I expected. I did start the newsletter with the idea that it would grow. When I wrote I wrote my manuscript with the idea that it would be a book and it would be published. That's kind of how I do things. So it wasn't a hobby, or it wasn't like, oh, I'm just going to do this and it'll be fun. It was like, no, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it. But that said, it got much bigger, much faster than I foresaw. I work at the university. So outside of my day job and my family, it's like this year has been, oh, that's the newsletter. It's the year of the Substack. And yeah, it really grew for someone without really I didn't come into it with a platform.
You had the elephant.
Elephant Rock, which
uh,
was my writing program that I started in 2012. Recently, like literally this week, we updated the website. So everything is now Writing in the Dark, just so it's not confusing. So
Okay.
it's Writing in the Dark, the school. But to answer your question a little more directly, I think, and I just want to be able to talk about this, yeah, without it sounding weird. But you said something at the outset of our time together today about generosity. And I have heard so many times in my years of teaching, so many times, and I didn't fully understand what it meant in my early years, but I've heard that word again and again. Oh, that you're such a generous teacher. Oh, this was so generous. And I would think to myself, what does that mean? Like, really not being flippant at all. Like, what do they mean by that? And then over time, I started to understand. I think it has to do with the idea, because the Substack isn't entirely teaching. It's a lot. The newsletter is a lot of things, but much of what it is teaching and talking about writing, and how writing is this vehicle for us, a way of living in the world. And one of the things that I have recently realized is like writing saved my life. So I teach it as if it might save yours. Like when I'm teaching writing, it's more than just can you polish it up and can you make it better, and what are some things you might bring to it to fix the structure. It's really about like how we write is how we are, and if we can kind of yoke those two things together, these amazing things can happen, because it's about being closer to the world. It's like what we just
Right.
talked about, that doorway. And I think it's a very specific, I'm certainly not the only one doing it, but it is a very specific way to teach writing. And I think that people have really responded to it. That's what I think is going on. Some people have told me, actually, just like last week, and this is the biggest surprise, that you can do this like through a newsletter. It's wild to me. But she said that she's been taking writing workshops for a really long time and is ultimately finding more value just working through the posts and the exercises and the craft essays than in more expensive workshops that she's taken. And obviously everyone has a different need at a different time. I love writing workshops. Like I think they're really important. I'm going to plan I'm teaching it one this summer. I'm going to plan one of my own in 2025. So by all means, workshops are super valuable, but I couldn't have imagined that we could create this level of engagement and like real work through a digital newsletter. It's kind of amazing.
Wow. How often do you post? Like, is it every day? Is it once a week? Is it 3 times a week?
Well, the official posting schedule is that there's a Lit Salon post on Mondays, which is something like, it's really loosely structured as kind of like an advice column,
Okay.
which is mostly about things that are related to writing.
Okay.
And then there's the Wednesday post is kind of like the big post of the week. And it's always some sort of craft essay with some sort of structured writing exercise, typically speaking. And when we're in a themed intensive, then those posts are, they're scaffolded. So they kind of all interact together. Usually they're discrete too. Like you could just start where you are, but they also build with each other. And then Thursday is our Thursday thread, which is really amazing. Like, when have you last sung to yourself or to another?
I
And
saw that.
did you see that? It's
I
just
did.
the
Yeah.
things that people are, and anyway, it's amazing. That's been amazing. And then Friday, I do an archival post because the community is growing so fast that it's been a really great way to just resurface some of the foundational posts and some of the things that are like, here's some things that are, like there was my 11 things post last December, which was kind of the beginning of the big growth spurt for the newsletter. And so resurfacing some of those foundational posts and then some of the fun ones or whatever, but it just gives a way for people to, posts that are probably like very buried, that might be harder for people to come by, but that people appreciate being like, oh, wow, yeah, no, I didn't see this one.
So let me ask you, if somebody said, oh, Jeannine, I want to start a Substack, like about writing, what would your most solid piece of advice be to them?
Before I gave any advice on that, I would want to know, like, who they were as a writer and what they wanted to share. Writing is a really broad topic, right? And so, what was their particular passion in the writing container? Because I think that when you're writing from that place, whatever that may be, it's just like in any other genre of writing. It's a very cliche thing to say, but we do have to kind of find the voice, and I don't think it's our voice, quote unquote. A different project can have a different register of our voice or tone of our voice, but so my teaching tone, right, is different from how I sound in the part that burns. We have a range, but we want to know what is the voice of the project. And so I think that's where I would start is with questions, is like, what do they want to bring? Because if they can get at that, it's so much easier. It's so much easier to just confidently plow forth. And the other bit of advice that I would give people is that it's okay if nothing is happening in the beginning. When I go back and look at the posts from the very, very early posts, when I reprise them as archival posts and stuff, there are posts that had no engagement at all on them. And I think that one of the nice things about being a little older, being 56, and I was 54 or 5 when I started this particular project, and not growing up on social media. I was a full grown, as the kids say, a grown ass adult, by the time that rolled around, right? And so I don't have this. Of course, I like it better when there's a burgeoning, like a bustling response, and it's busy and people are. But if it kind of goes out there like a lead balloon, I just move on. I don't dwell on it, and I think that's very important because it will take time, and it's important not to give that bandwidth, in your mind and in your heart. It's like nobody liked it. It's actually probably nobody saw it. Like it's going to take time to get some traction.
And that's really the essence of writing, write for yourself, write for what you want to put out on the page, and don't worry about what anyone else is thinking at the moment. That's for later, right?
It's for later. It's for later, right? Yes, because I teach with that. We have to have that super playful and an experimental and vulnerable and risk-taking way. And then there's the reader, and then there is the reader. And then we have to be like, okay, so what is it that this other human being is going to experience when they read this. And so then we shape it toward that as a different process in the writing. And then we have to let it go. Then there's that third phase where it's like, and then it exists as its own thing. Maggie Smith wrote really beautifully about that in her post about you could make this place beautiful, reaching its 1-year mark. And it has a life outside of her now. It exists in the world in different languages that she doesn't read or speak. And Elizabeth Gilbert has spoken really beautifully about that too, about Eat, Pray, Love, and how people will approach her, in the world and say, she wrote the most beautiful thing. It might've been in Big Magic where she said, people will come up and say, I was in an abusive marriage too. And she's like, yeah, I wasn't in an abusive marriage. My marriage was abusive. That's not in the book. I didn't say
They perceived it that way. Yeah. And people put their own whatever on it.
Yes.
Yes.
And in addition to that, we're going to make mistakes. There might be typos. There might be, we might look back at a sentence and say, like I would fix that if I had it to do over again. And that's also part of it. Part of it is like the letting go,
And be generous with yourself. If you're being generous, as a writer with the writing community, but be generous with yourself and be accepting, I guess, of yourself. Like I always say to people, I may not appear vulnerable like in person, but if you want to understand my vulnerabilities, read my writing. You will see it. It's all there on the page. My ectopic pregnancies, my parenting with hearing loss, all the things that I've dealt with, that's on the page. And so I think writing is a way for us to excavate those emotions, put them in a container where they're available for public consumption. And then whatever the public is going to do with it or imbue it with, that's up to them.
Yeah, exactly. We don't ever, I don't think, move past or, fully relieve ourselves of our major heartbreaks in life. But there is something very freeing about being able to say, look, I made this thing and now it exists outside of myself.
Yeah.
And not only did I make a thing, I made it into a beautiful thing.
Yes.
I took a heartbreaking thing and I made it into a beautiful thing. And like, that's kind of magical. That's a magical thing.
I love that. Final piece of writing advice. That's all you, Jeannine.
Just one, huh? Okay. I think this is coming from what I'm teaching right now. I think my final piece of writing advice is that even though many of us are telling stories about lived experiences and about, like you said, excavating the interior, I would invite people to please remember to hold yourself always to looking hard at the outside world, to really being devoted to observing that outside world, the world outside of ourselves, how it works and what do we see there and what is happening in the world outside of ourselves. And I'm talking about like right in front of our own eyes, the way the leaves are moving on the trees, the fact that the grass is just starting to green, the fine layer of dust on the piano, like really noticing and training that capacity to notice will change the writing.
That's beautiful. Oh my God. Now I want more writing tips from you.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for speaking with me. It was such an insight into how you think, how you create, and how you teach. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Follow me at estelleserasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.